The United States has had enough. It believes it's spending too much on defending countries thousands of miles away from its borders, and it's about time it all stopped. That money should go to defending America at home, which can only mean one thing: a complete withdrawal from NATO. We'll be explaining what happens next on today's episode of The Infographic Show as we explore NATO's fate without the US day by day. Day 1. It's a move that's been a year in the making. The United States triggered Article 13 of the NATO Treaty by providing a notice of denunciation to the rest of the group's members. Ironically, the US gave that notice to itself per Article 13 before disseminating the information to NATO's 31 other members. It was huge news at the time, but the process was slow enough to give Europe's leaders hope. Maybe the US president would change their mind over the course of a year. They would see how valuable NATO was both to America's defense and to its ability to project power and influence over the rest of the world. After all, wasn't America the only nation to have ever triggered Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, asking others to come to its aid in the wake of the September 11, 2001 attacks on its territory? Surely that had to count for something. Unfortunately for the rest of NATO, the US doesn't change its mind. The one-year denunciation period ends, and the US starts actively preparing for withdrawal from NATO. That starts with the military bases America has dotted around Europe. Alarm bells are ringing in the commands of those military bases. There are dozens of those bases being hosted by America's former NATO comrades. Germany, Poland, the UK, Belgium, Norway, Spain, and Portugal are all home to US military personnel. All told, there are over 40 bases spanning from Greenland, which is owned by NATO member Denmark, and Turkey's border with Russia. They all start shutting down. Day 2. The shutdown is moving faster than anybody could have anticipated, and it all starts with the withdrawal of the 20,000 soldiers the US sent to the smaller NATO member states bordering Russia and Belarus. Those 20,000 US soldiers, who are primarily stationed in the Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, along with Poland and Romania, don't all leave at once. It takes time to complete a full withdrawal, but they're on their way out. Elsewhere in Europe, similar withdrawals are starting at other US military bases. Germany starts losing many of the 39,000 American personnel it has stationed in its country. Hundreds of the 10,000 American soldiers in the UK are packed into ships and planes as they head back home. Italy's 13,000 US troops are also leaving. It'll take several months for the US to pull its forces out entirely, but by the time it's done, Europe's NATO members will have lost between 75,000 and 105,000 soldiers from the US Army, Navy, and Air Force. But there is one bright spot for Europe's NATO members. The American soldiers may be going back home, but they're leaving behind billions of dollars of infrastructure. The US can't exactly pack up its bases and send them back home, and it spent heavily on its European NATO bases. In 2022 alone, America poured $3.8 billion into its European Deterrence Initiative Fund, followed by $4.2 billion a year later. Most of that money went to building airfields, storage facilities, and training complexes, all of which the US leaves behind. Sure, the storage facilities are gradually emptied of America's weapons in the coming months, but they're all on land that Europe owns, and the US can't justify or execute the demolition of the infrastructure it's spent so long building. But at least the US is saving some money. It paid 66% of the $2.5 billion annual cost of using and supplying those bases, with its allies covering the other 34%. Those NATO allies now have to cover 100% of the costs, with the US saving itself about $1.65 billion per year, a drop in the ocean for a country that spends over $840 billion on defense annually. Day 10. The withdrawal is well underway, and the leaders of Europe's NATO members are panicking. They had a year to prepare for what was coming, but they still weren't ready. That's pretty typical of Europe. The European Union, or EU, often finds itself mired in debates. With so much crossover between EU and NATO members, there's been a whole lot of talking about what to do when the US withdraws, and not enough action. On day 10 of America's NATO withdrawal, more talking comes. European leaders, including France's president and the UK's prime minister and Germany's chancellor, convene in Brussels to discuss what happens next. Some of those leaders have plans. Germany, for instance, is already readying itself to take control of the bases the US is deserting. The same goes for the UK and Italy. All of these countries talk about the changes they're making to their militaries so they can make use of the infrastructure the US is leaving behind. But arguments are already starting. The Baltic states are especially concerned. With the loss of the 20,000 soldiers the US primarily stationed in those three countries, they are all severely weakened. Combined, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia only have around 48,000 soldiers. It's a solid combined force, but it is nowhere near strong enough to deal with the 1.3 million plus soldiers that Russia could flood those nations with. The Baltic states tell NATO's European leaders that they are the vanguard for NATO. They're the first line of defense against the biggest threat NATO faces, and they are severely underpowered. They need more troops and equipment now. But as is so often the case in Europe, there are no immediate commitments. The UK, France, and Germany all promise soldiers to the Baltics, but they don't say how many or when those soldiers will arrive. They need to protect themselves first, which means building up their own militaries before they look further afield. The meeting is tense. Divisions are already starting to form as America's protective umbrella is pulled away from NATO's European members, and all the while, Russia is salivating at the prospect of taking on this new version of NATO, but that can't happen yet. But in the coming months, we'll start to see Russia make some interesting moves that further weaken NATO in Europe. Day 14. NATO's European members are hit with another blow. America's nuclear weapons are leaving along with its troops. NATO's nuclear sharing program hasn't disappeared, but the largest contributor to that program has. The US stationed nuclear weapons in 5 NATO nations before it withdrew: Belgium, Italy, Germany, Turkey, and the Netherlands. Over the next few months, those nukes are taken back home, removing the nuclear blanket that has so long protected Europe. That's not to say that the remaining NATO members are completely without nuclear weapons. The UK has 225 nukes, with France bringing 290 to NATO. Germany in particular is keen to become the new home of some of those nuclear weapons. It has a good argument. Germany is closer to Russia than either France or the UK. It seems like a natural choice for stationing, but it's also clear that NATO's nuclear threat has been significantly reduced. Even looking beyond the 100 American nuclear weapons the US removes from its European NATO bases, the simple fact is that NATO without the US is a long way behind Russia in the nuclear warhead game. Moscow's stockpile stands at just under 5,600 nukes. That's more than enough to devastate all of European NATO multiple times over if war broke out. America has over 5,200 nukes that, with France and the UK, previously put NATO's stockpile just above Russia's. Now NATO has only around a tenth of the nuclear weapons Russia has. The UK also has a problem with its Trident nuclear missiles. Though technically independent, those warheads rely heavily on American technology and infrastructure, along with US cooperation in testing and maintenance. All of that is gone, with the UK forced into negotiating expensive contracts with the US to ensure Trident remains usable as a nuclear deterrent. These types of logistical problems start to cause issues in the coming weeks. For now, France and the UK are figuring out what to do on the nuclear front. Negotiations are ongoing with Germany, though all 3 countries agree stationing nuclear weapons in Berlin is best for all involved. The UK and France are also quietly talking about teaming up to build more nukes. Nothing has been said to the remaining NATO members yet. Neither country wants to antagonize a Russia that's already gloating and throwing nuclear threats around at the remains of NATO. But both know that they, and NATO by extension, need to create a stronger nuclear threat. Month 1. European NATO is starting to struggle. Losing the US troops stationed in Europe took its toll. Most of the continent's NATO members have been forced to scramble to repopulate the military bases the US left behind. The nuclear weapons stationed in Germany and several other countries are leaving. Leaders within Europe are already quarreling amongst themselves about what to do next. They'll need to come up with some answers soon. A month into the US leaving NATO, it's become very clear just how vital the US was to Europe's military logistics. In 2016, the US and EU signed an Acquisition and Cross-Servicing Agreement, or ACSA. According to the EU, this agreement facilitated reciprocal provision of reimbursable logistics support, supplies, and services between the European Union and the United States during military deployments and operations. In other words, the US and its European compatriots in NATO cooperated intensely on the continent to make it easier for European troops to move supplies and people around. That is all gone now. While the ACSA might still exist after a month, it's practically a lame duck agreement. The US is pulling out, and it's taking so many of the logistical advantages it brought with it out of the NATO equation. Losing that support will have far-reaching consequences for the new NATO. Of course, no US means no American troops, vehicles, or logistics in the event of a war. However, European NATO has also lost the US as a training partner and a potential supplier of military equipment that it can use to fend off threats. Europe has also lost access to America's intelligence, meaning it knows far less than it did before about what its enemies might be doing. There's now an even deeper lack of unity within Europe. There were already signs of this division forming when the European leaders met in the wake of America's withdrawal, but historic decisions are also starting to weigh down. As Carnegie Europe's Judy Dempsey points out, European NATO as a collective refused to unify many of its weapon systems, including tanks, fighter aircraft, and helicopters. Sure, there are some instances of cooperation, such as Britain and France working together to create Storm Shadow missiles. However, those are often isolated examples. That lack of unity throws European NATO's logistics into chaos, and it's not going to be an easy problem to fix when the remaining NATO members can't even reach a consensus on the level of threat facing them. The new NATO needs to get on the same page fast. But in the months that follow, things are not all rosy for the United States either. Month 2. The immediate mood upon the US's withdrawal from NATO was celebratory, at least in some quarters of the country, but problems are starting to form. For so long, the US was the glue that kept the NATO alliance together. The existence of NATO also led to the US being the main deterrent against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, along with being a key player in NATO's campaigns in the Balkans. The US also spearheaded the provision of military aid to Ukraine during its war with Russia, both directly and by selling weapon systems to allies that were later sent to Ukraine. Through NATO, the US has spent decades building geopolitical influence through its alliances with other NATO members. It was all a part of America's free world policies. For the 75 years or so of its NATO membership, the US was able to lead the Western world in following a rule-based system that enabled America to project power. Democracies all over the world used the US as their standard-bearer, their gold standard. Through its alliances, the US was able to support international institutions, bolster trade, and open up markets for itself. By the second month of its withdrawal from NATO, America is quickly learning what happens when it turns its back on that approach. On the power projection front, America has lost one of its most important forward presences. It's no longer a direct threat to Russia via the bases it maintained in Europe. The US has also catastrophically damaged its relationships with the remaining members of NATO. All European countries trusted America to be the binding force and the main power projector that keeps threats like Russia at bay. That trust is now broken, and the US is starting to feel the sting. Of course, the US can fend for itself. It has oceans on either side of it, the Atlantic and the Pacific, that protect it against China and Russia. The country also produces enough oil to meet its own energy needs. For instance, 2020 saw America produce 18.4 million barrels of oil daily, at a time when its population needed 18.12 million. The US is also fine on the food front. In 2010 alone, its agricultural sector produced enough food to offer 4,000 calories per day per person, more than enough to feed its population. But none of that changes the fact that trade in oil, food, and in so many other commodities is vital to the US. Trade between the US and EU, the latter of which includes many of NATO's European members, totaled $975.9 billion in 2024, with the US importing $605.8 billion of goods from Europe during that year. Trade with the UK, a NATO member that isn't part of the EU, amounted to almost $380 billion. That trade doesn't simply go away now that the US has withdrawn from NATO. However, the trust issue is in play. NATO's European members no longer trust the US to follow through on its promises. That leads to many of NATO's European members looking elsewhere when it comes to trade. They can't cut the US off entirely. That would lead to economic catastrophe. But America is starting to fall off as the trade behemoth it's always been in the past. And there is one area where America is really feeling that sting. Month 3. So much of America's disentanglement from NATO was predicated on the idea that NATO's European allies weren't doing enough to protect themselves. Veiled threats were made. The US suggested it might not protect NATO members that don't hit the organization's 2% of gross domestic product spending target on defense. Europe was told it needed to figure out how to defend itself without American involvement. It's starting to do just that, and that shift in approach is having an impact on America's arms trade 3 months into the US pulling out of NATO. There were already signs that European NATO was working to decouple itself from America's weapons sector before the US withdrew. In December 2024, Britain signed a deal with aerospace firms in Italy and Japan to work on the development of a new 6th-generation fighter jet. Those plans are accelerated, with European NATO members canceling purchases of F-35s from the US as they anticipate the arrival of a European alternative. Across Europe, we see weapons manufacturers, including Germany's Rheinmetall and Britain's BAE, receiving new contracts for land weapon systems that may have previously gone to the US. The effect isn't immediate. Contracts that have already been signed are often still in effect, though there have been some cancellations. However, the US won't see record numbers of exports for its arms industry again anytime soon. In 2024, America earned a massive $318.7 billion from arms exports, representing a 29% increase from the previous year. Much of that money came from NATO nations buying American weapon systems to send to Ukraine and replenish their own stockpiles. In the coming months, European NATO will focus on building up the defense industry on the continent, reducing its reliance on America's weapons. The net result for the US? Tens of billions of dollars of lost weapons trade to add to the billions it may lose in goods and services trading. Again, it all comes down to trust. How can the remaining 31 NATO members trust America's weapons now that the US has withdrawn? After all of those weapons require US involvement beyond manufacturing, including US-led maintenance, training, and intelligence. It's much better to centralize all of that and cut the US out. NATO's decision to move away from American-made weapons also creates domestic problems for America. Though the US spends around $850 billion per year on defense, companies like Lockheed Martin and Boeing still rely on overseas sales. Fewer sales mean profits are down, which ultimately leads to thousands of Americans losing their jobs. Still, at least America has what it wanted. In a sense, Europe is learning to defend itself. What it might not have expected is that European NATO is becoming more self-sufficient and will hit American pocketbooks hard. Month 6. The cyber attacks have started, affecting both the US and the remaining members of NATO. This was inevitable. America's withdrawal from the Collective Defense Alliance created obvious openings for the likes of Russia and China. Both have already been extremely active on the cyber front, even when the US was a part of NATO. Between 2000 and 2024, Russia launched 378 cyber attacks with a political dimension. China, Iran, and North Korea weren't far behind. They launched 340, 154, and 153 attacks respectively. With NATO weakened by America's withdrawal, these politically focused attacks ramp up. Europe and the US are inundated with fake news, social media profiles, and attacks on their political systems to create even more division. Without cooperation between the US and NATO, those attacks are harder to stop. More worrying, especially for the US, is the threat that these cyber attacks create to the Western nuclear deterrent. It's believed that Chinese hackers have been active in American computer systems for at least 5 years. Beijing could use this to launch a crippling cyber attack that makes it harder for the US to count on its nukes. Those based on land face key threats, with cyber attacks capable of taking their launch systems offline. However, the US also discovers its nuclear threat isn't as powerful because it's no longer part of NATO. America's F-35s and nuclear bombers may be among the best in the world, but that doesn't mean much if they're isolated in the US. European NATO won't allow America to use its bases as stop-off or launching points anymore. That leaves America's submarine fleet as its main nuclear option. Those submarines are effective, however the US has only 14 of its Ohio-class submarines capable of launching ballistic missiles. If cyber attacks and a lack of cooperation take out America's other nuclear options, the door is open for Russia or China to become the world's key power players. Speaking of which, Year 1. With America's decoupling from NATO came 2 major blows to Ukraine in its fight against Russia. Europe did the best it could, but with so many of the weapons provided to Ukraine being of American origin, combined with the diplomatic squabbles within European NATO, Ukraine couldn't hold out for much longer. It capitulates. Russia takes Ukraine and begins a period of recovery. Without the US as a part of NATO, Russia can contain its threat to Europe and not worry about American intervention. Over the next few years, an arms race develops in Europe, Russia having already built a military-industrial complex to ensure weapons keep flowing to its troops in Ukraine, has the advantage. It also has alliances with countries like North Korea, with which it has a mutual defense pact, China, and Iran. All 3 become more confident in supplying Russia with weapons to make up for its manufacturing shortfalls. Europe is forced to play catch-up. Bruegel suggests European NATO would need 300,000 more soldiers and a collective defense spending hike of over $270 billion to catch up to Russia. That would add to the 1.5 million active military personnel NATO has. Plus, European NATO still has access to more advanced weaponry than Russia, even if it can't match in sheer volume. But there is one thing that NATO doesn't have, with or without the United States: Russia's brutality and imperialistic ambition combined with the forced unity that comes with being led by an authoritarian. Both Russia and the remains of NATO are preparing for a fight. Year 3. Russia is ready to fill the security vacuum left behind by America's withdrawal from NATO. Europe has managed to prepare itself for a fight in many respects. Britain and France chose to stage some of their nuclear weapons in Germany, though conversations about staging them in other NATO member nations closer to Russia stalled. Therein lie the problem for the remains of NATO. Division still exists. While nations like Poland and Germany ramped up their defense spending, 3 years wasn't enough to create the unified weapon systems and logistical systems European NATO lacked once the US withdrew. Russia takes advantage. After spending 2 years replenishing its military, it goes on the attack. The Baltic nations, so long considered the vanguard of European NATO, stand no chance. European NATO stationed tens of thousands of troops in the country, but it wasn't enough to create a solid frontline defense. Russia takes on each individually. It has also learned its lessons from the early weeks of the Ukraine war. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, along with thousands of tanks and artillery, pour into the Baltics in a shock-and-awe campaign designed to destroy Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania quickly. It works. The former Ukraine becomes a Russian staging area for attacks against Moldova and Romania, with the Baltic nations quickly falling. Russia is also able to use the Baltic Sea to stage naval attacks on Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. Its ground forces march into Poland via Belarus and the former Ukraine. But European NATO doesn't capitulate. Far from it, in fact. Though slow to respond to Russia's shock-and-awe campaign against some of the less militarily strong NATO nations, hundreds of thousands of troops pour into the front lines. Canada, which is still a NATO member, provides troops and equipment to support Europe, officially starting World War III. The US now faces a tough decision. It's no longer a part of NATO. It isn't duty-bound to protect its former NATO allies. But does it simply stand back and watch as Russia pushes to take over as much of Europe as it can? Perhaps it'll try to serve as a peacekeeper, but in doing so it could unintentionally hand Russia a powerful advantage. With NATO weakened, Russia may leverage the shift to reassert control over the former Soviet states, all while pushing for a peace deal on its own terms with what remains of European NATO. Or maybe the US will simply stay isolated, allowing European NATO and Russia to fight it out in a war that dramatically weakens both nations. The weakening could create openings for the US to become an influential force in Europe once more, as it takes advantage of its former NATO colleagues needing its military and economic help. Only time will tell. What do you think would happen if the US pulled out of NATO? Will Europe be able to defend itself, or would Russia take advantage of the situation? Or would the split be far more peaceful than in this scenario? Let us know in the comments, and thank you for watching this video. Now go check out NATO versus BRICS. What's the difference and how do they compare? Or click on this video instead.